Hello, good afternoon. My name is Magda Tetter, and I am the Schwidler Chair in Judaic Studies at Fordham University. And I'm really delighted to welcome you to our another of our Zoominars, this one on related to Pride Month, and we're very happy to have with us Elazar ben Lulu and Deborah Megdal. So Elazar ben Lulu was supposed to give a talk at Fordham in April, but it was canceled like everything else. And I was really delighted that we were able to reschedule something for June, and I want to thank in particular our very loyal member and friend of Fordham, Mark Black. So Elazar's original talk was Pride Shabbat services celebrating gender, sexuality, and body in Israeli Reform Jewish congregations. But since that time, he also published an article, Who Will Say Kaddish for Me? The American Reform Jewish Response to HIV and AIDS epidemic. So we have had, since the beginning of the COVID crisis, a series of events on epidemics and Jewish history. So it seemed like a perfect combination to combine his research that he was supposed to share with us related to Pride Shabbat on the Pride, during the Pride Month, with the topics that we've been discussing over the last 2 months. And it is an important history, Jewish history, LGBTQ history. So I'm really delighted that we managed to get Elazar ben Lulu with us in conversation with Deborah Megdal. So let me introduce the speakers, and then I will hand over the screen to them. So Elazar ben Lulu holds a PhD in social and cultural anthropology and is an anthropologist with interest in religion and gender, especially in the intersection of LGBTQ identities and Judaism. His PhD dissertation examines religious rituals in Israeli Reform Jewish congregations and demonstrates how rituals become political performances that affirm and empower gender and sexual minorities previously excluded from Jewish liturgy and hence Jewish community. He is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Israeli Center for Israel Studies at Ben-Gurion University, at the Ben-Gurion Research Institute for the Study of Israel and Zionism. He's also a recipient of the Salo Baron New Voices in Jewish Studies Award, which is awarded by Columbia University and jointly by Columbia University and Fordham. Deborah Megdal holds a JD from Yale Law School, where she was the managing editor of Yale Journal of Law and Feminism. She also worked on an amicus brief to the Ninth Circuit and the case that legalized same-sex marriage in California. She worked in impact litigation at Lambda Legal, research gender in military and in family law, help low-income clients struggling with issues of domestic violence and custody. She has a very, very long, very impressive CV. She switched from her legal career to rabbinics, and she is currently a rising 50-year rabbinical student at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York and a senior Cooperberg Rittmaster rabbinical intern at the congregation Beit Simchat Torah. And that congregation is particularly important in our conversation for the history of the LGBTQ community and Jewish history. It was founded in 1973, and it welcomes gay men, lesbians, bisexuals, transgender, queer, and straight individuals and families who share common values. So welcome, thank you, and without further ado, Elazar and Deborah, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much. So first, I would like to share my screen. Let's do it. Host. Who can allow to share my screen? Deborah, maybe you? Oh, maybe now. Yep, now it's working. Here we go. One minute. Yes. Okay, so thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yeah, everything is correct. It's working. Good. So first of all, thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity. Yeah, I can't be in New York City, unfortunately, but I'm here in Tel Aviv. Maybe it's close. Let's talk about it later. But I really appreciate this invitation, and I would like to appreciate and to thank again Professor Magda Teter, Professor Rita Bishai, and to my partner, to Deborah Megdal, for this wonderful session. So our title is From HIV/AIDS Epidemic to Pride Shabbat, Liturgical and Cultural Transformation in Progressive Judaism. Actually, as Professor Magda Teter said, it's sort of a combination between two articles that I've already published. The first article focused on Israeli Reform congregation and how Israeli Reform Jewish congregations celebrate Pride Shabbat services. It's ethnography focused on what's going on in Tel Aviv, in Halev Reform congregation here in Tel Aviv, and it's present an ethnographic description about the phenomenon and about the intersection of gender sexuality and Reform Judaism. The second article is more, it's focused on the American Jewry, different period. It's not on the contemporary phenomenon. It's focused on the HIV/AIDS in the last century. And it's provide more sociological, historical view on the phenomenon. And so that's, you know, as an anthropologist, I focused on the present, but that was a wonderful opportunity for me to examine also the history of the Reform congregation and the intersection of Reform congregation with issues such as sexuality and gender. And it's based on my archive work in American Jewish Archive in Cincinnati, in Malkus Center. And thanks again to the wonderful team at the archive that allowed me to expose to these wonderful and historical resources. So we're talking about two different articles. I have only 15 minutes, so I'm not going to talk about the articles. I guess you can read the article, and I would love to share with you the articles later and to send it by email. But I want to mention some arguments or some assumptions for our discussion today. So first, the articles show how Reformed Jewish congregation is a safe zone, safe gender zone, safe religious gender zone by creations of rituals dedicated to LGBTQ community and women. The ritual has become a political act. It's a political performance who allow to the participants to express their gender and sexual identities and orientation. So big. Yeah, it's happened sometimes, but it will be okay. So prayer, it's not only a way that we are only contact with God. It's not only an intimate worship with God. It's also a moment that we feel connection to our body, to our sexuality, to ourselves. And the tradition, it's not only something that associated with the past, but it's also something that really use us as a source of gender recognition, source of human rights. So it was very interesting for me to discover how people experience the moment of the prayer and how they see the synagogue not only a moment to connect and to worship and to fulfill their religious commitment, but also for their their secrets, their narrative, their excluded experiences based on their gender and sexual orientation and identities. I want to talk about two categories when we examine the intersection of gender, religion, and gender, sexuality, and Judaism. So I want to talk about two different categories when we examine the intersectionality of gender, sexuality, and Judaism. I would like to invite us to think about two categories, two variables, two factors. The first one is time. From HIV/AIDS epidemic to Pride Shabbat, from to. So sometimes we see time as something really linear, chronological category, but unfortunately we get some reminders that even although the reason that the time it's a factor, time during the time along the years the reform the LGBTQ community achieved political rights and has improvement in their political missions. But unfortunately, sometimes time it's really remind us that nothing really changed. LGBTQ phobia, it still existed, unfortunately. So when we examine the intersection of gender, sexuality, and Judaism, and examine different sociological and cultural phenomena, time we should ask ourselves, how do we reform time, and if we really understand the complexity of time. That it's not something only linear, not in the development of the LGBT community, but it's something more complicated that reflect exclusion and inclusion tendencies. And the queer time, time for LGBTQ community, it's something really repetitive. I mean, it's coming out of the Jewish closet, it's something of the coming out of the closet and coming out of the Jewish closet, it's something that's endless process. Every time we come out, when we talk about our sexuality, when we're talking about our partners, when we're talking about our family. So, okay, there is a date for the moment that we come out of the closet and we have the narrative, but time after time, we deal with this experience again and again. But time, when we talk about time in this landscape, it's not only we are not only focused on the queer time, but also about the Jewish time. For example, Pride Shabbat, that, as you can see the picture, it's from Halev congregation here in Tel Aviv. Pride Shabbat in Tel Aviv. It's wonderful example to see how time to examine time as a linear, as something that really helped to develop and to achieve rights and to create new rituals and to think how the rituals, how different people can find themselves in the traditional moments. But on the other hand, as you can see, the second picture reflects how Jewish time, it's something that it's not only reflect renewal expressions, but also how people preserve traditional customs and rituals. Even in Israel, for example, this picture is the sig that the Ethiopian Jewish custom every year that they celebrated in Ethiopia. But even after they immigrated to Israel, they continue to celebrate the sig. I mean, after the immigration, they continue to celebrate the ritual to express their Zionist vision. So it's interesting to think about time as something that takes us forward, but also give us the opportunity always to preserve or to think about the past and how the past really play on the present moment. The second category that I would like to invite you to think when we examine sociological cultural performances or phenomena, particularly the intersectionality of gender, religion, and sexuality, is space. Space it's a political category. Yeah, space is the configuration of supervision, of control, of protest. We know the term safe space in the queer term safe space when we want to define gay-friendly space. I mean, the space, it's not an instrumental tool or instrumental category. It's a political category which allowed people to feel sense of belonging, to feel associated, affiliated with the area, and to have the opportunity to resist. So when we examine the ritual or the text, for example, when I examine the ritual and the text, the queer performance, I always think about the space and the politics in the space. Particularly when I understand the connection and the relationship between what's going on abroad in the state and what's going on here in Israel. Yeah, maybe the prayer is the same prayer because Shabbat service is Shabbat service, but no, different places, so different places, different people, different interpretation, different politics. So the connection and the relationship and the negotiation between New York City to Tel Aviv, for example, it's not only a movement to understand the connection between Jewish diaspora and local Jewish in the ethno-national space, but it's also an opportunity to think about the LGBTQ community as a transatlantic community, the connection between the history and the conflict of the American LGBTQ revolution to what's going on in Israel. And Pride Shabbat services, which I examined during 3 years of fieldwork here in Israel, it's actually and originally American ritual. Yeah, it was established in American Reform congregation, and the gay synagogues were established in the end of the 70s in San Francisco, New York, Los Angeles. And so I have to take in consideration what's going on abroad, what's going on in North America if I want to understand the moment here in Tel Aviv that people collect together to celebrate in June their sexuality and their gender. Yeah, that's wonderful. That's such a wonderful picture from Sha'ar HaZahav. Sha'ar HaZahav, it's the Golden Gate community from San Francisco, one of the dominant and the first gay communities, reform communities in San Francisco. And here we have a different picture from Jerusalem. So the way that people in Israel understand the way for protest and the way to express their gender and sexual visions, for example, by protesting in the city, it's come from abroad. I mean, and the connection between the global and the local, between New York City to Tel Aviv, it's a moment. The religious product, after all, it's sort of a glocal product. I mean, it's a combination. It's infusion between what's going on in religious in Jewish communities abroad and in Israel. And for example, how Sidurim and how prayer textual book, which originally created abroad, now translated to Hebrew, and for example, the prayer for the twilight, which talk about the non-binary categories, gender categories, which when we translate it to Hebrew, it's not only a linguistic performance, it's a political performance because Hebrew is a gendered language. So space is something that on one hand we can find in different spaces, as I said, different rituals, but we find also intersections and we find also similarities between different spaces, between what's going on abroad and how Reform congregation abroad celebrate and and invite LGBT community to be a part of the community and in Israel. And for example, one more comment regarding what's going on in Israel in Reform congregation. In my article, I argued that the way that when people choose to go to Reform synagogue in the area that in the Israeli ethno-national state, once in the Israeli national space, the authority is Orthodox, the Orthodox monopoly, that's the authority. And then for creation of Jewish performance, for creation of Jewish consciousness, it's a political moment, and especially when we find the intersection between the LGBTQ community that find a place in Reform Jewish congregation in Israel and the Reform movement, that the Reform movement understand that understand the potential of the LGBT community to be a partner, to be a participant, and to be a congregant in the communities. So it's a political vision of which challenge not only the gender order and the heterosexual consciousness and the heteronormative behavior, but it also challenged here in Israel the Orthodox values, the way that Israelis understand and define their Jewishness and their Jewish identities based on orthodoxy, based on Orthodox values. So in this moment, the disadvantage and the marginality of the Reform Israeli congregation has become an advantage because the marginality create creative performances and open the doors for other excluded categories in the Israeli society, such as the LGBTQ community. So that's why I don't know if you can hear. Can you hear? No, maybe you can hear, but yeah, I will skip it because I want to. Yeah. So that's why I decided to talk about space and time when we think about intersectionality of gender, religion, and sexuality, and we examine different areas, what's going on here in Israel, and how the Jewish identity politics and the LGBT politics are managed here in Israel, and what's going on abroad, I think it's interesting to understand and to find similarities and differences, and to understand how, after all, tradition and prayer and synagogue is a place of protest, a place to give the people of the opportunity to express their vision, to express their self, and not only protest in the urban space, for example. So thank you so much for this opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to hear Deborah.
Thank you so much. We will see if we can stop the screen share. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks.
I want to thank Magda and Fordham University for inviting CBST and me to speak. We've already had a lot of fun in even just preparing for today. I've had some interesting conversations with Elazar and in reading his scholarship. So before I speak about CBST, I want to just note from reading his work some overlapping themes that I noticed. Although we are not a Reform congregation, we're not affiliated, and we've never been affiliated, I noticed some themes, which so I'll say the themes first, and then as I tell the story of CBST, we can look for them together. The role of lay leadership in really shaping a community even from the beginning and throughout its history. Intersectional identities and the value of diversity. Shared exclusion from mainstream religious life as an opportunity and a source of connection and community. At CBST, LGBTQ identity and also HIV/AIDS status have been really opportunities for connection based on shared exclusion, and religious practice as a political act. So I think that, so keep on the lookout for those shared themes. I'm so really have a lot of joy to tell the story of CBST. I know we have some CBST members here who've heard some of these stories. You can't hear them enough. CBST emerged from traditional Judaism. We were founded mostly by gay men, some of whom had come from Orthodox backgrounds, where they could no longer find a home because they couldn't be fully Jewish and fully their gay identities. And so they had to shape a dual identity that was both gay and Jewish. And one of the first flyers, the first CBST flyers, which I think really captures CBST's mission, reads, "Perhaps the greatest attraction of all is the opportunity openly to enjoy one's Jewishness and one's gayness." And this founding story, which is from 1973, it's been 47 years, is that Jacob Gabai placed an ad in the Village Voice in early February of 1973. Just a few lines: "Gay synagogue, Friday night service, and Oneg Shabbat." And then the address of the Church of the Holy Apostles in Chelsea, a church, basement entrance. So this was a more hidden entrance. And the story goes that he packed up candlesticks, kippot, kiddush wine, and challah in 2 paper shopping bags. And from those early days, we have been dubbed the shopping bag synagogue. And many people claim to have been at that first service in February of 1973, although there were really only 10 to 15 people there. Many people say that they were there and maybe were there in spirit. It is important that from the beginning, all of these were lay people. Some were more traditional in practice, but that tradition only went so far. And for many years after, and even still to today, after Shabbat services, many would go out together to the gay bars and clubs in the nearby Greenwich Village. In the mid 80s to the early 90s, there was a period of growing tension between this traditional, so that many of the founding members were really traditional in their background. So a desire to preserve that tradition and the recognition that there was a need for change. For example, there were early debates over whether it was okay to do a meditation instead of standing Amidah prayer using the traditional liturgy. There was even a debate, this may surprise some, it surprised me when I learned of this. There was a debate about whether we should have a mechitza, which is a barrier between men and women, whether there could be a service just for men or a service just for women. And we did have alternative services. We had a main service, and then we had a more participatory service, which was also called the feminist minyan. It had more women who participated, and there were more women who attended. Then there was also a more orthopractic minyan, which was more orthodox in practice, but still had to count women in the minyan. We were always egalitarian. And one little funny story about the mechitza question is that a young man called the office and wanted to know if we have a mechitza. And the answer was no. And he was disappointed. And he said, his reason though is what's funny. He said, well, I couldn't possibly come if there's no mechitza because I can only sit with the women so that I won't be distracted by looking at the men. And that really captures some of the mechitza question for us. With all these growing pains in these early years, well, we still have growing pains. All communities have growing pains. CBST chair Mel Rosen at the time, who led CBST, urged everyone to remember, diversity is our strength, not our weakness. So that really, that captures some of the really early pain of figuring out how we would create a Jewish community when we're not affiliated, and we're figuring out how to do this among a lot of lay people with different backgrounds. Also in the early 1980s, really the defining aspect of CBST community life was the impact of AIDS. And when I start, I'm going to share my screen now for a few minutes to show you some archival footage imagery, really, which is from the oral histories that have been collected so lovingly in our 40th anniversary book, which was written by Ayelet Cohen. And I'm going to share my screen, and it will work. Okay, let's see if this works. And then I'm going to play. So looks like it's playing. Wonderful. Okay. So if you'll look in this first slide, which is a letter from CBST member Michael Levine in Israel, writing to his friends, other CBST members, Yehuda Berger and Mark Bieber, regarding something that he didn't understand, a medical condition that he couldn't understand, unexplained weight loss, weakness in his legs, a disease that the doctors didn't know, they didn't know what it was, and he will resume testing once I return to the States. But this is before we even had a name for what was happening. And then in this next slide, we see one of the first CBST newsletters, the first one that mentioned the disease that would become known as AIDS. This is from 1982. And this article, The Diseases That Plague Gays. And this is introducing a program where 3 prominent doctors will speak about symptoms and potential causes and preventative measures for this disease that no one understood at the time. And our newsletter came out even a little bit before this famous first New York Times article, which is at the bottom of the slide, which is from May of 1982. And this is about a new disorder that worries health officials, which was at that time described as GRID, gay-related immunodeficiency. And so you'll see that we were, even before, we didn't have a name either. This was a time in our community when I think maybe we now today can tap into that for a little bit. The idea of not understanding a disease that is happening. There's a lot of fear and panic. A lot of people are dying. And I know that I feel like I have more of an understanding of what that might have felt like given what we're going through today with COVID. But add to COVID all the social stigma that was associated with HIV/AIDS and all the deep secrecy and shame at the time. And then maybe we can begin to understand what it was like during this time. Approximately 40% of the men of CBST died from AIDS. You can see in this photograph, there's an asterisk by the men in the photo who died from AIDS. Many organizations got their start with the help of CBST members, key HIV/AIDS organizations. Gay Men's Health Crisis, which was started in 1981 by Larry Kramer, Zichrono Livracha, who recently passed, an important advocacy organization and support organization. CBST Chair Mel Rosen testified before the House Committee on Government Operations about the severity of the crisis. He was the executive director of GMHC. A lot of political activism. CBST member Peter Vogel was active in the New York State Democratic Party, became close to the governor, and established the New York State AIDS Institute. A lot of legal advocacy. CBST member Bill Hipsher in 1983 was a member of the board of directors of Lambda Legal, and he waged the nation's first AIDS-related discrimination case involving a doctor who was treating AIDS patients and was actually kicked out of the co-op where he was practicing medicine because he was treating AIDS patients. And they ultimately won that case, so the doctor could remain. Just to capture the feeling of the time, I want to quote from Michael Levine, who's still an active member of CBST, who recalls that every Friday night, this is during the 1980s, every Friday night we would come to shul and we would say, "Oh no, someone else." The thin face, the marks on the skin from the cancers, the pneumonia, and in a year or two, they would be gone. This was a time when there was a lot of caregiving happening at CBST, the Bikur Cholim Committee in 1986. programs that would provide meals on Friday afternoons, the beginning of the AIDS Walk fundraiser, which also at this time, which still happens every year. This year it'll be virtual, I believe, in July. Early liturgy. So I'm going to share a little bit more about our current liturgy today. But the really early liturgy was hard. We really we were a traditional congregation, so we started with reciting Mourner's Kaddish, reciting Psalms. This shifted gradually as there was really more urgency with the crisis, and we started creating new liturgy. Having the first AIDS healing services in 1987, the first Passover Seder for people with AIDS, and a communal fast day, which was led by Saul Zalkin, who's still a very active member of CBST. Let me see if I can, there we go. Another important moment in our history was also in 1987 that CBST made a quilt with the names of those in our community who died from AIDS and sent a delegation with this first quilt to be part of the Names Project on the National Mall. So you can see at the bottom of the screen, Annette Miller, Zichrona Livracha, who's fixing the quilt. And in the black and white photograph, if you can look really closely, you can see Yolanda Podosinsky, who's currently our executive director, on the floor, finishing the quilt. And this reflection is just so beautiful. I don't think I have time to read it, of what it felt like to look at all the different AIDS quilts spread out across the National Mall. My God, the enormity of it, the thousands of names spread out like a carpet upon the lawn before me. This is a testimony from the time. And this is one of our AIDS quilts. There have been a few with the names of members of our community who died from HIV/AIDS. And now I want to share, well, first I want to take, I'm running out of time. I want to just share that CBST has been engaged in other types of activism other than around HIV/AIDS. It would take days to describe all of it, but one example from this period is that in 1988, Ruthie Berman and Connie Kurtz, Zichrona Livracha, and two other couples brought a lawsuit against the New York Board of Education seeking domestic partner benefits. And that suit helped to lead the city to grant those benefits in 1994. So that's just an example. There's a lot of other activism, but I don't have time to go into all of it. The next, I would say, pivotal moment in our community was in 1991. There were so many deaths from AIDS that the Ritual Committee created a booklet for use during services and decided that we needed to hire a rabbi. And one of our current board members, Roseanne Leipzig, describes that a lot of us went there kicking and screaming. This was a lay-led synagogue, and there was a lot of resistance to hiring a rabbi. So in 1992, we hired Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum, who's still our senior rabbi. And within months of her arrival, she officiated at the funeral of our synagogue president, to give you an idea of where we were in that moment. And now I'm just going to take, I'm out of time, but I'm just going to take a few minutes to go through some modern liturgy in the Siddur that we use now. It's not working. There we go. Okay. So it's a lot. I'm not going to be able to go through all of it. This is our Siddur. One change in our liturgy that I love is this is from the Chadodi. So traditionally the text would be Kimsos Chatan al Kala, that God rejoices like a bridegroom rejoices on a bride, but we've changed that to Kimsos Lev Ba'ahava, like a heart, God rejoices like a heart in love, to encompass all kinds of love relationships. We have the Baruch Hu. We have two versions of the Baruch Hu, including this one on the right, which has feminine God language, blessing God, but blessing God in the feminine. We have gay and lesbian poets. Their poetry is in our Siddur that we use every week, including Adrian Rich, Walt Whitman. In our prayer for peace and protection, this is underneath the Hashkivenu, we read that the gay community learned that the reality that none of us knows when our time will come. We learned this through AIDS, which matured us in a tremendously painful way. We include the matriarchs. Many progressive shuls do, but we added Bilha and Zilpa. The idea being that we should celebrate all kinds of relationships and family structures, whether they're equal married relationships or not. This is a renaming blessing we have for those who are transitioning, which is really beautiful, and a coming out blessing. And then I just want to say one little bit about Pride Shabbat, since we're in Pride. This is what Pride Shabbat looks like most years at CBST. This year it will be online, but it's just a beautiful, joyful, large celebration. And we have a special prayer. So in Jewish liturgy, we have this Al Hanisim for Chanukah and Purim and special holidays. Rabbi Ayala Cohen wrote one for Pride Shabbat. And it's really beautiful. I don't have time to read it, but it talks about how we've come to this day and the civil rights victory. And this last line, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. It's become a very important phrase and has a lot of meaning in our community because of our creating of identity around exclusion. And then these are just a couple photos from Pride. And here is our book with our history, which has a lot of this archival footage. If anyone's interested in buying it, here's the link. And that's it. And I'm sorry that I went a couple minutes over, and I appreciate your patience. This has been lovely. Thank you. I'm gonna stop my share.
So I don't know whether you two want to speak and respond to each other, but as you are gathering your thoughts and questions, I do want to encourage our audience to post questions in the Q&A section button at the bottom of the screen. So I don't know whether you wanna respond to each other, or shall we?
Yeah, I would love to start if it's okay with Deborah.
Yeah.
First, thank you so much. It's such a fascinating presentation. Thank you so much. And when you present the materials, I always told myself, oh my gosh, it's like what's going on here, but it's in Hebrew here, but the original source come from your community and other communities in the state. And you opened the presentation with the affiliation issue. You said we unaffiliated the community. We have different people from different, who define themselves by different definitions. And I think that the affiliation issue, it's really interesting when we talk about the differences between how Jewish identities construct, Jews in Israel construct their Jewish identity compared to the state. For example, in Israel, most of the congregants who take a part in Reform congregation, they don't define themselves as Reformed Jew. I mean, it's not the identification. It's not crucial for them. They come to the synagogue and they choose by their values the synagogue, and it's enough for them just to come to the synagogue, and they don't really say, I define my Jewish identity as Reform Israeli Jew. And this is, on one hand, it's problematic because the Jewish politics conflicts here in Israel and the marginality of the Reform movement in Israel needs that people identify themselves as Reform. Yeah, I'm Reformed and I want my rights. The naming of the identity, it's really crucial for the revolution, for the Jewish revolution here in the ethno-national space. But on the other hand, it's invited us to think about not how people define themselves, define their religious identity, but how people doing religion. We are more doing religion than define religion. So it's interesting to think about the twist between identity and performance. It has two questions for you. The first question is, how do the community deal with crisis, with communal dilemma? For example, if 70% of the community members disagree to put mechitza on or other, to include different, I don't know, prayer, how do the rabbi or the participants create dialogue or get the solution for this moment of crisis? Because as anthropologists, I always recognize the crisis as an opportunity to think about creative solution and to see how people keep the community borders or the community solidarity, etc. The second question is how maybe can you explain the transformation between the masculine leadership of CBST to lesbian female leadership today? And maybe maybe this case can reflect about the general LGBTQ politics. I don't know, I'm just thinking about it.
That's interesting. I think that well, I think I can sort of answer both of the questions by saying that it's really we have our own, so we're not affiliated with a movement, but we have our own, because we have such a long, rich history, we have our own kind of CBST way of doing things, which has, changed, and there have been growing pains over the years. But it is important to us that, we have a rabbi, we have a Reform rabbi who's on staff. We have our senior rabbi is, as a Reconstructionist rabbi, but also is part of the Reform Rabbi Professional Association. I'm studying to be a conservative rabbi, and we have had, although our senior rabbi is a lesbian, we have had, we have rabbinical interns, and we have a large clergy team that's included many men. So it's not that, I wouldn't say there's necessarily a phenomenon of male leadership to female leadership, but certainly Rabbi Kleinbaum has shaped the history of CBST in really foundational ways for the many years that she's been our senior rabbi. But we certainly have leadership both in the clergy and in our lay leaders. That's very important. I think, I'm not sure if this is true in other shuls as much, but because we began with such a kind of a grassroots lay leadership, it's really continued to today, that we have lay leaders involved in many aspects of our ritual life today. So I think that answers your second question was about gender. So I think that I'm not sure if this is about CBST specifically or progressive Judaism more generally in America, but I think there was I think maybe there was a backlog of women who weren't allowed to become rabbis for a long time. And so now they are becoming rabbis. So there are certainly more women rabbis, female identified rabbis, non-gender conforming and trans rabbis who are all of a sudden allowed to become rabbis. So we may see a kind of a phenomenon of more of them being overrepresented now, because many of them were not able to for a long time. So that might explain some of that largely in the Jewish world. I don't know if it necessarily applies to CBST, but I think that's it. I think it's interesting to think about what does it mean of the profession of being a rabbi being more feminized, changing. So I think for a lot of Jewish tradition, the profession of a rabbi was to be a scholar, and now the profession of the rabbi, especially in progressive Judaism, in America at least I know, encompasses not only being a scholar and being a legal authority, but also being a pastor. So it involves care in a way that it didn't always involve in a formal way. So I think that those more traditionally feminine qualities are being encompassed in the modern, non-Orthodox progressive rabbi in a new way that I think is really beautiful.
Okay, thank you. So I have a couple of questions from the public, but I also want to make a comment and ask my own question. One of the interesting thing, obviously, as you mentioned with Hebrew, is the gendered language that is very binary in this way. And I just this morning had a conversation with a colleague who works in Spanish, and in contemporary Spanish there is a third gender now developed. It's a neutral, it's inclusive, it's used by, so it uses the E, the E. So él, ella, ella is the third gender, and then nosotros, nosotras, nosotres is less, again, gendered. So I wonder whether there is any movement within the Hebrew language that is trying to be inclusive. And that leads me at some level to Deborah, you were talking about the liturgy, and Elazar, your work has also dealt with some of the issues. I wonder what are the Jewish textual sources that can be used in that liturgical innovation. And by now, and this is sort of ties into one of the questions from the public, by now we have really all Jewish movements responding to the LGBTQ inclusion, right? I mean, this is next year will be 20 years since Trembling Before God. It's already 20 years almost. So I wonder whether you could comment on that question of inclusion, on the sources, Jewish sources. I saw Walt Whitman, but other, what are the other inspirations that might be drawing on Jewish tradition?
Well, to your first question, I don't, Elazar could probably tell me if this is happening in Israel, but we have this non-binary Hebrew project, which is interesting. It's trying to build, so Hebrew is a very gender binary language. It's trying to build a non-binary Hebrew. So for example, last week we have a themed Pride Shabbat every Shabbat in June. We had Trans Pride Shabbat, and we had our Ba'alet Tfilah is a non-binary beloved member of our community who's studying to be a cantor, and they instead of Ba'alat Tfilah or Ba'alat Tfilah or Ba'al Tfilah, Ba'aleh, so the with like with a sagol is the one way of making Hebrew non-binary. I don't know if this is really spreading in Israel, but it's interesting to find a way to make such a gendered language less gendered. So as far as we've gotten so far in our Siddur is to give masculine and feminine, so to give masculine and feminine God language, but we don't have non-binary God language yet in our Siddur. It was published in 2007 or 2008. So, but that's the next frontier, is to find a way to do it.
I think it's interesting. Thank you, Magda, for this question. I think it's, for me, I'm always, when I see the text and I see the moment that person see the text and, oh my gosh, it's different. It's not the name of the God that I know how to pronounce it, for example. It's really interesting moment to see the negotiation between the worshiper and the text. And I think most of the Reform rabbis in Israel, sometimes they include feminine expressions or reclaiming the masculine expression in other language, but in other words. But sometimes they create new words. For example, instead of to say God, Rabbi Efrat Rotem from Halev congregation say the spirit of the world. And different rabbi from Jaffa congregation use the Kabbalistic term Yud Ke Vav Ke, Yehovah, the name of the name according to the mystical terms. So maybe it's a creative solution how to offer to the participant to feel comfortable with the moment. So it's interesting to understand who is in the center. Who is in the center of the prayer? Is it the person or God or the text? And what's the between the liturgy and the sociology? I mean, as anthropologists, I'm interested in how people experience the moment and how they create their interpretation to the moment that they see the prayer textual, the Siddur, the prayer textual in front of them, and how the rabbi try to deal and to face with, on one hand, with his or her feminist vision, and what's going on in the field, how people actually deal and face with these liturgical changes.
Yeah, I do think what we do affects meaning, and obviously the words that we use in our liturgy, and also how we act. So of course, if there's a mechitza or not is important. But for example, at CBST, when we call people to the Torah for an aliyah, we don't want to assume we know their gender identity. So we use gender neutral language. We say either na la'amod or nikra la Torah, in order to not assume a gender. And then they can say, you know, their name in Hebrew using gendered language, or they can say mi beit, which is a gender neutral way. They say their name and then mi beit, from the house of, and then their parents' names. So we've created new rituals that allow for more space, and that allows people to feel more understood in our community, that we know that they're not just either a man or a woman.
Mm-hmm. So there are a couple of questions that are about difference, and the difference between the different Jewish denominations toward LGBTQ Jews, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, and, you know, where CBST obviously is not part of that, but also the question of difference between Israel and the US. And one specific, it's bounded in that question of difference between Israel and synagogues in Israel for Elazar, is the question of inclusion. What happens when other religious movements and synagogues and become inclusive, and how is why is CBST able to survive as a primarily LGBTQ space when so many other synagogues become inclusive? So the question of difference between different denominations and inclusivity, and between Israel and this.
I love this question, because it is true that, well, I'm you know, in New York City, and so many of the progressive synagogues here, I mean, all of them are very welcoming to me as a lesbian and to all of our, you know, LGBTQ identities. But the answer that means the most to me is that there's a difference between being included and tolerated and even loved and welcomed, and being the one to welcome. So for us to stay in we're an LGBTQ community, we have many straight identified members, but it's our space to welcome and to be, it's ours, we are the ones who will welcome and include. And that's a different power, there's a power shift there that's important. So however inclusive a shul that's not LGBTQ identified will be, however loved I will be walking in the door, it's not the same as me being the one to welcome everyone and being the host. So that's one of the, I'm sure there are many reasons, but that's the one I find most meaningful when people ask, well, do we really need an LGBTQ shul anymore? Yes, we do.
Yeah, thank you, Deborah. I think in Israel, it's depending if it's official or not. I mean, the dominancy of the halacha, that's the monopoly. The orthodoxy, the orthodox monopoly, that's the authority among Israelis. So Orthodox synagogues, you know, maybe it's not if I'm a gay, for example, as a gay person, if I go to Orthodox synagogue and I will not say, yeah, I'm gay, so it's okay. But if I would say, I don't know what will be the response, but I don't have opportunity to celebrate, for example, my marriage or celebrate Pride Shabbat in Orthodox services here in Israel. And compared to conservative and reform congregation in Israel, and as a non-Orthodox theology, non-Orthodox liturgy offered the platform for a religious platform and religious texts and rituals for the LGBTQ community. And of course, it's not only, as I said before, it's not only a religious or theological vision, it's also a political reason. In Israel, the conservative and the reform congregation are signed on the left side of the political map. They promote civil rights and they create different cooperation with different society. For example, the Palestinian society here in Tel Aviv, the congregation in Jaffa create coexistence Shabbat services with the Palestinian in Jaffa. And it's wonderful to see how Shabbat services, instead of to be a moment of Jewish control or supervision in public space in Jaffa, it became a coexistence moment. So the combination between the theological reason and the political reasons come together because the marginality of the non-Orthodox communities in Israel.
And that is a nice segue to the to another question. We just have a few more minutes. That is about the differences that may exist between Israel and the US regarding the LGBTQ community about under the law. That is, we were talking about the different religious attitudes, different inclusion, exclusion, but what about law?
So in Israel, you don't, I mean, you can, I will talk about myself. Yeah, we had a nice wedding, but officially we can't marry by the government. The government don't accept us as a married couple. I have to fly to New York City or other city for the formal marriage. And so the celebration, it's okay. You can do it and you can find a place to celebrate your, but the formal law, it's against the law. You can't really, the government don't accept your marriage. In the army, for example, the Israel Defense Force, you know, it's okay to be a gay, but officially it's okay, but let's talk not officially. The experience of soldiers in the army, it's more complicated to come out in this area because, you know, it's patriarchal area and it's very complicated, but they try to encourage people or to say, okay, it's okay. But it's bringing me to the issues of pinkwashing and how sometimes the Israeli government use the LGBT community as, I don't know, as a statement to show that Israel is really liberal, heaven in the Middle East, but it's not. The LGBTQ people are still fight against the LGBTQ phobia and struggle to achieve their civil rights for surrogacy, for formal marriage, and etc. The bubble of Tel Aviv, it's a bubble. Let's talk about it. Yeah, it's a bubble and you feel comfortable like in New York City, but there is not, it's not a safe zone. It's not hermetic or a closed safe zone. There is no pure safe zone for LGBTQ people, even in the center of Tel Aviv.
And although I think, of course, there are different challenges in Israel than there are here in America, where we have more of, not a total more of a separation between religion and our state. But before we had marriage equality, our Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum was performing same-sex commitment ceremony, religious ceremonies, before there was an ability to have a civil ceremony to go along with it. So for many years, she was performing these ceremonies, and that's also an important part of our history. That you know, that as the legal, you know, as we've achieved legal progress, and we had a big decision yesterday also in America for LGBT rights and in employment, that they should be protected under the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act against employment discrimination. But as the legal landscape has changed in America, it is in these little, as you said, I think these smaller communities in these little, they're not totally sealed off from the world, but in small communities where political change can actually happen on a small scale. So another example in our community is, as I mentioned, you know, we have a very diverse clergy and people on our staff, including straight rabbis. We even have a male Orthodox rabbi who's a scholar in residence right now, doing work on trans rights and Jewish sources. So that itself, so small, you may think that, you know, that's a small act, but actually those are political acts. Performing a Jewish wedding before it's legal civilly is a political act. Having an ultra-Orthodox rabbi who wears a black hat and works at CBST doing his scholarship is a political act. We for years we're not doing it now because of the pandemic. For years, part of our religious practice has been standing outside of a mosque near NYU downtown, trying to show our Muslim brothers and sisters that we care, that they feel safe during their prayer. Just standing outside with signs. was part of our preparation for our Shabbat service. That seems small, but it actually is a very big political act. So, and I learned from reading Elazar's scholarship, learned a lot about, how to put the kind of from an anthropology perspective, that small religious communal acts can be very politically charged. And I see that all the time at CBST today and throughout our history. And it raises the stakes of the work that I do. And it's part of, there are a lot of reasons, but it's part of the reason why I've always wanted to be a rabbi, even when I was a lawyer, wanted to be a rabbi and wanted to do law in this different way. They're very related. Jewish law is very related to secular law. Judaism is a very legal tradition, but because of the power of these small ritual acts that seem small but are really so big.
Well, I want to thank both of you for a wonderful afternoon and sharing your knowledge and your experiences. I do want to say that we have shared Elazar's two articles, and if you are not on our mailing list, please email us at jewishstudies@fordham.edu. We do share readings. I also want to recommend for those of you who are interested in reading more about queer texts in Judaism and Jewish history, there is a wonderful anthology of texts called A Rainbow Thread, an anthology of queer Jewish texts from the 1st century to 1969, which includes both famous medieval homoerotic poetry, but also modern poetry and rabbinic texts, and it is available in English. And we'll share a couple of excerpts from that on our next mailing list. So again, Deborah and Elazar, thank you so much for joining us. I'm grateful and happy Pride, even though it's virtual.
Thank you. And I put the link to the book of our history in the chat in case anyone wants.
Okay.
Thank you so much. This has been such an honor.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Hugs from Tel Aviv, virtual hugs.
Happy Pride. Happy Pride.